Hello, and welcome back to Railroad Quarterly, my tri-monthly overview of developments in the North American rail industry. Today we'll be recapping the months of December 2024 and January and February of 2025. Before we get into December's news, though, I want to mention two things quickly. First off, if you haven't heard yet, I've recently updated my channel membership program, and for just $1 a month, in addition to exclusive rail fending videos and members-only updates, you can now get early access to all my videos. If that sounds good to you, consider joining. Secondly, somehow in last month's episode of Railroad Quarterly, I completely forgot to mention some pretty major news, so let's start there. On November 10th, Amtrak started running a brand new long-distance route, kind of. In order to free up superliner equipment for western long-distance routes, as well as to alleviate congestion in and out of the East River tunnels in New York City during construction, Amtrak combined the Capital Limited and Silver Star into one train called the Floridian. Trains 40 and 41 now run between Chicago and Miami using Amfleet and Viewliner equipment, and will most likely remain this way for the next few years. Speaking of new Amtrak routes, towards the end of November, initial ridership numbers were released for Amtrak's new Borealis route between Chicago and St. Paul, Minnesota, with ridership numbers 10 to 15% higher than originally expected. This is a great sign not only for Amtrak as a whole, but specifically for this route, as the Wisconsin Department of Transportation is already considering the possibility of a second daily round trip. Finally, into December. On the 2nd, Norfolk Southern released its 21st Heritage Unit, likely as a result of CSX's completion of its final Heritage Unit. In late November, CSX released its 21st Heritage Unit, one-upping Norfolk Southern's 20. As a result, NS held an in-house vote to determine a 21st Heritage Unit, and out of the 4 options, the Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia Railway supposedly won. After being rebuilt and painted at Norfolk Southern's Juniata shops, NS AC-44 C6M number 4851 was rolled out to the Altoona Railroaders Museum and displayed to the public for the first time. As of now, the two railroads are tied with 21 heritage units each. The next day, a 43-year-old Amtrak AEM-7 was saved from the scrapper's torch when a newly founded railroad preservation group by the name of Northeast Rail Heritage announced it had acquired AEM-7 number 927. For more than 5 years, a handful of retired AEM-7 locomotives have been stored and slowly dismantled in Rhode Island, but now 2 have been saved, one by the Danbury Railway Museum and one by the Pennsylvania-based Northeast Rail Heritage Incorporated. Northeast Rail Heritage plans to cosmetically restore the 927 to its original 80s-era Phase III paint scheme, as well as to keep it mechanically serviceable for potential excursion service in the future. As of right now, it's unclear where 927 will be moved for restoration, but I'll be sure to talk about it when those details are released. On the 6th, Florida East Coast's new autonomous track inspection vehicle was spotted for the first time, testing the tracks along FEC's main line. The new ATIV is an SD40-2 based inspection car that will collect track geometry data while in motion. Similar to Norfolk Southern's Brick and CSX's track inspection boxcars, this SD40 will move around Florida East Coast system periodically and check for track defects. On the same day, the Government of Ontario, Canada officially awarded a contract to build stations along Ontario Northland's Northlander route, a new intercity rail service between Timmins and Toronto. At the same time, finalized renderings of its new trains built by Siemens Mobility were released. These new 4-car Venture train sets will be mechanically similar to the trains currently being built for Via Rail, but will feature a paint scheme nearly indistinguishable from that of Netherlands National Railway. Service is currently expected to commence in 2026, with testing supposedly beginning sometime this year. Speaking of Canadian passenger rail, on the 9th, VIA officially launched requests for qualifications for new long-distance trains. Currently, VIA's long-distance passenger cars are more than 70 years old and in dire need of replacement. Its locomotives aren't much better, with nearly 40-year-old F40s and 25-year-old P42 locomotives in charge of long-distance service. The release of RFQs marks the first step in a decade-long fleet replacement project, of which new modern, accessible, cleaner, and more reliable trains will be procured. Stay tuned for more updates in the near future. On the 11th, California Representative Kevin Kiley announced his plans to introduce a bill that could ban any further federal funding for the California High-Speed Rail project, which he, as well as Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, have deemed to be a waste of taxpayer money. Luckily, once introduced, this bill will have to be passed by the House and the Senate before making it to Trump's desk, but if it somehow does get passed, this could mean the end of California high-speed rail, at least between Los Angeles and San Francisco, which is currently billions of dollars short of what's needed to build. Of course, this bill won't eliminate state funding from being used, but if made entirely dependent on state funds, it would make California high-speed rail even harder to get done. The next day, the first Phase VII railcar was spotted on Amtrak, with the Viewliner 1 receiving the new paint. Over the course of the next year, more locomotives, as well as Horizon, Amfleet, and Superliners will also receive this look. On the 15th, the final segment of Mexico's Tren Maya was completed, with the full 900-plus mile network across the Yucatan Peninsula now in service. This is just the beginning of Mexico's nationwide passenger rail network, which has been making big steps towards the future in the last year. Speaking of steps to the future, on the 17th, Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey introduced the All Aboard Act, a new piece of infrastructure legislation that, if passed, would provide billions in funding to expand, upgrade, and modernize passenger rail in the United States. Included in the bill is a $3.5 billion rail formula funding program, which would give each state consistent federal funding for rail projects, much like how highway projects are currently funded. This would make it much easier for states to expand their intercity rail networks, as they would be able to receive funding without having to compete for federal grants like they currently do. Next up, the bill would include $50 billion for electrification projects, allowing intercity, commuter, and even freight railroads to build wires, power substations, and the other infrastructure needed to electrify. In addition to major funding for electrification, $80 billion would go to the improvement and expansion of intercity rail, $30 billion would go to consolidated rail infrastructure and safety improvement projects, all of which would fund zero-emissions projects. Another $30 billion would go to Amtrak, and $10 billion would go to eliminating railroad crossings. Additionally, $500 million in funding would be dedicated to decarbonizing rail yards in environmental justice communities, and $300 million would go to workforce training centers and labor protections for all the construction that would be funded by this bill. Like the California high-speed rail funding cuts, this bill would need to make it through the House and Senate, but if this somehow got approved in the next 4 years, it would mean unprecedented changes for American rail. On the same day, Amtrak released an update regarding its long-distance fleet replacement project, which is currently about 7 months behind schedule. Currently, its proposed bi-level train sets have been deemed not feasible by rail equipment manufacturers, leaving the project in a weird state of limbo. No manufacturer currently wants to take on this order, meaning Amtrak will have to come up with some sort of compromise in the near future. Hopefully some changes will be made in the next few months, I guess. The next day, the Federal Railroad Administration awarded Cascadia High-Speed Rail just under $50 million for the early planning stages to bring high-speed rail to the Pacific Northwest. This proposed route would create high-speed rail between Eugene, Oregon and Vancouver, British Columbia. The next day, photos leaked of an HHP-8 wrapped in a Phase VII livery in Amtrak's shops in Delaware. This former electric locomotive has been made inoperable and will likely enter service in 2025 as a cab car on the Northeast Corridor. As of right now, 5 HHP-8-8Cs are planned to be converted to control cars, with 2 having already been converted. It's expected that they'll be used to increase frequency on the Northeast Corridor, running on the push-pull consists that currently use ACS-64 locomotives on either end. On the 20th, all new HR 4000 cars built by CRRC made their debut on the LA Metro D line. These cars, along with newer HR 5000 cars built by Hyundai Rotem, will eventually replace all aging A650 cars built by Breda in the late 80s and early 90s for the B and D lines. On the 21st, President Trump selected David Fink, the former CEO of Pan Am Railways, as the head of the Federal Railroad Administration. As a New Englander, and as someone who cares quite a bit about the rail industry, I can say with complete certainty that, for one, having a former railroad executive running a government agency that's supposed to enforce railroad safety seems like a conflict of interest, and of all the railroads to choose an executive from, Pan Am has to be the absolute worst. The next day, CPKC placed an order with Wabtec for 170 ET44AC locomotives. This is a completely routine locomotive order on its own, but it marks the first time in about half a decade that a Class 1 railroad has placed an order for new locomotives instead of rebuilt ones. In recent years, railroads like Union Pacific, CSX, and most notably Norfolk Southern have switched to modernizing older locomotives instead of buying new ones, but it seems that CPKC is trying to break this trend. Good on them. On the same day, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority broke another long-standing trend when they announced that for the first time in at least 20 years, all 4 of its rapid transit lines were slow zone free. This comes after the system-wide meltdown in the summer of 2022 when the Federal Transit Administration nearly had to take over the system. Finally, after doing 40 years worth of maintenance in about a year, the red, blue, green, and orange lines all have a clean bill of health. The next day, the state of Colorado reached a deal with Union Pacific to allow for a new intercity passenger service between Denver and Craig, a small city in the northwest corner of the state. This deal was able to be made thanks to the fact that the Moffett Tunnel, a vital part of Union Pacific's central corridor, is actually owned by the state of Colorado, and was on a 99-year lease to Union Pacific that ended on January 6, 2025. As part of a new 25-year deal, Union Pacific will no longer have to pay the state to use the tunnel, and in return, as many as 3 round trips a day could run of what the state is calling Mountain Rail, a route that could begin service as soon as 2027. On New Year's Eve, a new locomotive was spotted en route to Canadian National. This odd-looking switcher, classified as a Q19-2.4GH, was rebuilt from a former BNSF 3GS21B switcher by Knoxville Locomotive Works and is a battery diesel hybrid, resulting in about a 50% fuel savings for the railroad. It's expected that this hybrid will begin testing in yard and local service in the near future. My favorite part of its hood was built from a shipping container. The same day, CSX released a locomotive celebrating its employees. This bright blue SD70 Mac promotes the railroad's recent OneCSX program, as well as displaying the logos of 14 labor unions affiliated with the railroad. On the 6th, the California High-Speed Rail Authority celebrated the completion of its first section of guideway for its Bakersfield to Merced corridor in the Central Valley, beginning the track-laying process. Despite quite a bit of pushback from the Trump administration, namely the Department of Government Efficiency, which doesn't have any real power by the way, California High-Speed Rail, as well as Governor Newsom, are committed to fighting against opposing regulation and remain optimistic that they can begin initial service by 2030. The next day, the MTA approved new R255 hybrid locomotives for service on the New York subway. These new battery diesel hybrids are currently in the process of replacing older diesel switchers and can run off battery power in poorly ventilated subway tunnels, something that's been an issue for the network's work trains for quite some time. As of right now, 25 units have been ordered, with a handful already being delivered. On the same day, the California Department of Transportation announced a $310 billion rail plan aiming to increase passenger rail's traffic share from 2% to a whopping 20% by 2050. This plan calls for new intercity routes, hundreds of miles of electrification, and of course high-speed rail. A week later, on the 14th, after just recently purchasing and rebuilding former CIT rail AC-44s, Norfolk Southern sold off 25 brand new AC-44 C6Ms to Wabtec, as well as 35 -9 donor units also bound for rebuild. Once rebuilt to the AC-44 C6M class, the 35 former NS-9s will join the 25 former CEFX AC-44s and will be sold to Ferromex. Despite its apparent motive power shortage a year ago, Norfolk Southern now finds itself with too many locomotives. Surely this won't come back to haunt them. On the same day, the Surface Transportation Board approved Canadian National's acquisition of Iowa Northern, a short-line railroad in, you guessed it, northern Iowa. About a month later, on February 13th, CN officially took over operations. Going back to California, which had just recently released its ambitious state rail plan, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB for short, announced it would be abandoning its plans to enact the in-use locomotive regulation, which was supposed to take effect this year. Announced in late 2022, the in-use locomotive regulation was intended, among other things, to phase out diesel locomotives in California by the 2050s, mandate railroad investment in zero-emissions technology, and ultimately cut rail-based emissions to almost zero over the next few decades. This regulation was subject to approval by the Environmental Protection Agency, which CARB now believes that under Trump would never be possible. On the same day, Alstom announced that it would be overhauling around 180 bi-level railcars owned by Toronto's GO Transit. This mass fleet refurbishment is expected to begin in 2026 and last until at least 2030. On the 6th, Portland, Oregon's TriMet welcomed Type 6 light rail cars into service on its MAX light rail network. These cars, like the previous 4 generations of light rail vehicles, were manufactured by Siemens Mobility and are planned to replace nearly 40-year-old Type 1 cars. 4 days later, on the 20th, after more than a year of review, the Federal Railroad Administration approved Parallel Systems pod trains for testing on 2 short lines down south. It's expected that in the next year, Parallel Systems will set up shop on the Georgia Central Railway and the Heart of Georgia Railroad and begin testing their autonomous railcars in a real-world application. On the 23rd, Kentucky Steam Heritage Corporation announced it would be holding an auction to sell off Nickel Plate 587, a 282 Mikado locomotive built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1918. This locomotive belonged to a private owner and was stored at Kentucky Steam's facilities in Irvine, Kentucky, but after the private owner stopped paying storage fees, the 587 was put up for auction. By the time this video comes out, the bid deadline will have passed, and the winner is expected to be announced on March 3rd. And yes, if you're wondering, Kentucky Steam Heritage has stated publicly that it will not be selling this historic locomotive to someone who will scrap it. On the 25th, after multiple years of sitting dormant, a new paint job in 2023, and a replacement turbo in the last few months, the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, Pennsylvania, fired up PSU 2020 Penn State's SD60i for the first time since it was donated. On the 26th, Brightline West announced that construction is officially supposed to begin on its Las Vegas to Los Angeles area high-speed rail line this April. Unfortunately, though, this means that Brightline won't meet its goal of opening in time for the 2028 LA Olympics, with the line currently planned to open in December of that year, just a few months after the Summer Games. The next day, less than a month after releasing the OneCSX unit, CSX released another specially painted SD70 MAC, this time for its safety train. First responder training, especially in recent years, has become pretty common on freight railroads, with dedicated trains traveling to communities they serve to train hazmat crews and first responders on how to deal with rail-related emergencies. This former CSX SD70 MAC was converted to a rolling training prop and will be used to train first responders on how to deal with situations like a punctured fuel tank, engine fires, and more. Although it looks like a locomotive, CSX 911343 is nothing more than a training facility and won't pull the safety train like NS 911 does. On January 30th, MARTA, Atlanta's public transportation authority, showed off its first brand new Stadler CQ400 train. These unique metro cars are expected to enter service late this year, replacing cars as old as 49 years old. In my opinion, when these cars enter service, they'll be the nicest subway cars in the country, not even to mention the coolest looking. On February 2nd, New Jersey Transit took a page out of SEPTA's book, applying Penn Central logos to a pair of its Aero 3 cars. A few weeks later, after a weird lack of news, on President's Day, Union Pacific announced it would be penning an SD70M in honor of Abraham Lincoln, who authorized the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Weirdly enough, this is not the railroad's first presidential locomotive, as Union Pacific 4141 was painted in honor of George H.W. Bush in 2005 and is currently stored at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas. On the 19th, the Government of Canada announced Alto, the official name for its high-speed rail project connecting Toronto and Quebec City. This project, previously known as Via High Frequency Rail, was given just under $4 billion Canadian dollars for the design of an electrified 186-mile-per-hour corridor. The design phase is expected to last around 5 years, and after that construction will begin, likely completing in the 2040s. Over in California, on the same day, CalTrans held a board meeting to discuss the future of its 3 state-funded Amtrak corridors, those being the Surfliner, Capitol Corridor, and San Joaquin's. In addition to ongoing locomotive rebuilds and the procurement of new Siemens venture cars for the San Joaquin's, the agency discussed its future equipment plans, including some very questionable projects. First off, beginning in the 2030s, CalTrans is considering overhauling some of its remaining F59 PHI locomotives from diesel to hydrogen fuel cell, meaning that yes, they expect that at 30 years old, the F59 PHIs will take to a completely different power source. Keeping with the theme of trying to retrofit vintage equipment, the state agency is also considering a heavy overhaul for its California and Surfliner cars, both of which are already around 30 years old, to have more inviting interiors, a modernized look, and ultimately to be able to defer the acquisition of new rolling stock into the mid-2030s. Once again, this is a classic case of California's state intercity rail setting ambitious goals, all on an extremely tight budget. Luckily, both of these projects still aren't set in stone, and hopefully CalTrans realizes that converting 30-year-old diesels to hydrogen fuel is completely ridiculous. The California State Rail Plan I mentioned earlier could play a part in allowing these corridors, especially the Surfline, to see some sort of actual modernization. Anyone who's ever ridden them knows all too well that they deserve it. On the 20th, Wabtec's new autonomous locomotive prototype was displayed in downtown Pittsburgh. Known as the Maverick, this Cybertruck on rails is a battery-electric critter of sorts that can apparently switch yards autonomously. In the last few months, the Maverick has been testing on an undisclosed railroad and will likely continue to do so after it's done with press events. The next day, Metro North released another heritage unit after many thought it was done. P32ACDM number 222 was wrapped in the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad's green and yellow paint scheme, which was the railroad's official livery until about the 1950s when the arguably more iconic McGinnis scheme made its debut. 222 joins 5 other commemorative units, as well as a handful of locomotives owned by the state of Connecticut, painted in the aforementioned McGinnis scheme. On the same day, the Illinois Railway Museum announced that it acquired Metra F40C number 614. 614 is a unique 6-axle passenger locomotive originally built for the Milwaukee Road in 1974 that served on Metra commuter trains until 2004. Since then, it's been stored at Western Avenue Yard in Chicago, but following the scrapping of one unit in 2020, its future was uncertain. Luckily, though this locomotive needs quite a bit of mechanical work done to get it running again, It's been saved from the scrapper's torch and will be restored to operating condition in the coming years. On the 24th, the Minnesota Department of Transportation and Metropolitan Council announced it would be considering discontinuing the North Star commuter train and replacing it with a bus service. This comes after an 80% decrease in ridership since 2020, with little to no recovery since. At the same time, the state legislature announced a bill that, if approved by the Federal Transit Administration, would shut down North Star operations. The next day, Metro North announced that it had ordered 13 battery electric charger locomotives built by Siemens Mobility. Similar to the SC42 DMs recently delivered to the railroad, these new electrics are planned to replace P32 AC-DM locomotives, as well as to expand service with the Penn Station Access Project. Unlike existing chargers, however, they'll be entirely electric, charging off overhead catenary wires and storing energy in batteries. The first units are expected to be delivered in 2029. Finally, on the 27th, Amtrak announced its search for a delivery partner to build its recently acquired high-speed rail project in Texas, formerly known as Texas Central. The process begins with the request for qualifications, which will be followed up by a request for proposals from potential builders. Despite funding being questionable at best in the next 4 years, Amtrak is hoping to continue its efforts to build this Japanese-style high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas. And there you go, that's the first quarter of 2025, and what a way to end it. Despite my generally negative outlook on 2025 that I shared in This Year on the Railroad, so far things have been relatively good for American railroading. If you want to stay in the loop about these stories as they continue to develop, consider subscribing and maybe even joining the channel membership program. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in another video.